Gentry 617, respond to report of shots fired.
The Coroner Talk podcast takes you behind the scenes with coroners, clinicians, and death investigators from around the world to provide training, news, and interviews from leading experts in the area of death investigation and scene management, bringing real stories and solid training together in one source. Now, here's your host, Darren Day.
Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of Coroner Talk. And yes, it is a full episode. This is not a weekly training focus. Today, we have a great episode for you. Jeff Gentry is going to be talking about the obstacles of investigating decomp cases. And you know, decomp cases, we all know them. We all love them. If you haven't experienced it yet, you need to. Everyone needs to experience 18 or 20 decomp cases. But in this episode, Jeff talks about decomp cases on the obstacles in time of death, cause and manner of death, just the obstacles of actually body exam and working the scene as a whole. There's a lot of things about a decomp case that's different than a regular fresh death, besides maybe the obvious. And many of you know Jeff because he teaches on our platform quite a bit. There's several online classes that he has. And so this is a longer episode, packed full of information. So without any further delay on my part, let's jump into that conversation.
Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, and that is decomposed bodies. So it is June now. I'm in California, so we're getting close to those 100-degree days, and I already know what to expect. So I'm going to go into work. I'm going to sit down with my coffee, thinking that I'm going to be able to type some reports, but no. Somebody's going to call in a decomposed body, or somebody's going to be found out in an orchard. It's always without fail, right when I start to relax at work. But they're some of my favorite cases. So what I really believe about decomposed bodies is that's what's going to separate a real death investigator from someone who is not a true death investigator, because these are the hardest bodies to find injuries on. You don't want to just go in there with that approach of, I'm just going to remove that body from the scene, take it back to the morgue, and let the doctor do their job, because you're missing so much critical evidence. I want to be that investigator that's going to find that, that gaping gunshot wound to the back of the body, or I want to find that ligature around the neck. I want to find those cut wounds to the inner arms. Those are the kind of things that I want to find at the scene of my decomposed bodies, because that shows that you are really doing an investigation. You're out at the scene, you're being proactive, and you're trying to find injuries on bodies versus just being a transport service. I just had one recently where this body had been in a room for about a week, and nobody had attended to him. Fortunately, the door was locked and nobody could have got in or out. So it really helped with determining manner of death. But that body was head to toe covered in maggots. It was hot. It smelled bad. The entire room was disgusting. But I went in there and I knew what I was looking for. I was looking for injuries on the body. So I was able to brush a bunch of maggots aside on the chest, and I found what appeared to be a gunshot wound to the chest. I wasn't 100% sure on scene, just because it looked a little different because there was so much maggot activity, but got the body back to the morgue, identified a bullet in the body. So with that, we were able to collect evidence at the scene versus just transporting that body and then finding that bullet or projectile in the body later. So these decomposed body cases are excellent if you want to show your investigative skills. The things that I want to talk about related to decomposition and decomposed bodies is, first of all, what is decomposition? What does it even mean? And then how are decomposed bodies reported? Your scene response. What do you do when you go to a scene? How do you prepare for it? And then ways to narrow down time of death. Remember, in most cases, you're looking for obvious signs of time of death, but on decomposed bodies, it's going to be a lot different. And then how do you identify a decomposed body? And then what do you use to notify that family? And then I want to tell you about one of the worst days of my life, and it absolutely has to do with a decomposed body. And then I'm going to share a couple case studies along the way. So let's start off with, what is decomposition? Decomposition, just plain and simple, is decay of the body. We've all seen decomposed meat. If you're a new investigator and have not seen a decomposed body, you should definitely get out there and see as many as you can, because that's the only way you're going to really prepare yourself for those really bad ones. And they're always going to come at unexpected times. Like I had one the other day, a guy had been dead for about 6 months. I had never seen so many flies in a house in my life. So that was kind of nice to see after 15 years of being a death investigator, something that you hadn't seen. So just plain and simple. As the body dies, the cells can no longer maintain themselves. We have a lot of bacteria in our body, a lot of chemicals in the body. And so when your cells can no longer keep up day-to-day activity and they start to break apart, well, then the bacteria takes over the inside of the body. That's what causes all of that bloating and swelling. The gases inside the body accumulate, and if they can't escape, then you're going to bloat. So the inside of the body, you usually start to see greening of the abdomen, like a green or a purple type color of the abdomen. That's where you're going to decompose first. And that's because you've got a lot of bacteria in your abdomen, in your intestines. So you're going to start decomposing from the inside first for the most part. And then, of course, depending on the environment that you're in, you're going to also start decomposing from the outside. Again, your cells of your skin are not going to be able to fight off bacteria, bugs, like they normally would. And so your cells are going to start to break apart, and you're going to decompose from the outside too. And then you might have bugs that infest your body, like flies. Remember, they're going to start laying eggs immediately once they can find a nice little hole to plant their little eggs in. And then also animals might have something to do with decomposition too. So we decompose from the inside and we decompose from the outside. And then you might start bloating, you're going to decay, and then after a period of time, once all of the cells and tissue have started to decay, then you're going to get down to the skeleton. And you might decompose to a point where you can see the skeleton. I've had plenty of decomposed bodies that have like kind of a juicy amount of tissue on them still, but then you can see skeletal features like the skull. You can see hand bones. You can even see areas where animals have gnawed on the bodies and taken parts of the skin and even the muscle away. So there is a lot of variety when it comes to decomposition, but just in general, it's decay of the body. And the environment plays a huge factor in how fast you're going to decompose. I've had bodies that are up in mountain areas. So here in California, the area that I live in, it's a valley, and so it is pretty hot. There's a lot of canals, there's some lakes, there's waterways, there's a lot of open land, there's orchards, and I've had decomposed bodies in every single area you can think of. I've also had a lot of them inside of houses, but then sometimes we'll get bodies that are up in the mountains, and they won't really decompose as much. They'll start to mummify a little bit. So they don't really have the bacteria and insects take over like they would in the valley area where I'm at, but they will start to kind of mummify, and it's where the skin gets a little bit leathery. And so that's a different type of decomposition. So just depending on the environment and how quickly the insects and animals can get to you, it's going to dictate how fast your body decomposes. So some of the decomposed bodies that I've had, usually about the 2 to 3 day mark is when it's the worst, depending on the heat. So you're going to get those bodies that are real bloated and purple. They're greenish. Their faces are bloated. And then they can have what's called blebs, and that's where the fluid in the skin accumulates. And if you're not careful, those things are going to pop, and they're going to get all over your shoes, and you're going to stink for days. You might get mummified bodies, like I talked about, where they're more dried out. If there's a real good airflow in a hot room, you might mummify more so than you will get that bloated stage. And then you might get those decomposed bodies that are just head to toe covered in maggots. And again, those are my favorite because that really allows you to narrow down time of death sometimes, and then also allows you to show how much investigative experience you have. Go out there when nobody else wants to look at that body, you're going to find those injuries. I cannot count the number of times that I have rolled up on decomposed body scenes and all the cops outside are putting Vicks under their nose, or they're out there smoking cigarettes even though they are not smokers. And they say they just went down the street to get a pack of cigarettes just because they couldn't handle the smell. And that's probably the most common question that I get as a death investigator. How do you handle the smell? And you don't. You never get used to that smell. It's something that is awful every single time, but as an investigator, you know that this is your chance to prove yourself and show how much skill you have at identifying injuries when no one else can. So decomposed bodies, how are they reported? It always is a bad sign when you get your first call and the paramedic or officer who's reporting the death starts off with, well, nobody's seen that person in about a week. Then they start to tell you that mail's piling up. And then they start to tell you that no one is answering calls, that there is dust all over the vehicle outside, or the yard is unkept. There's bills piling up on the front porch. And then they always go into, well, people started smelling something a couple days ago, but never reported it. And then, of course, they start looking in the windows, and there's flies either dead on the windows or they're just going crazy trying to get out. So those are always horrible red flags when you get that first call, but you know right away that this is a case that you need to go out to and you need to investigate, because every decomposed body should be treated as suspicious. And I'll go into that a little bit more in a bit. One case that I had one time was, it was in the middle of the night, and it was in a area it's a residential area. It was a really nice area. And what happened was the neighbors started noticing water flowing out of the front door and into the driveway. And this is an elderly lady that lived alone. And so the family got called, and they went to check on her. Paramedics and firefighters went around to the side of the house, and then they looked in the bathroom and found what they thought was a dead body in the bathtub. What had happened was this woman, she went to take a shower or a bath, and she ended up passing away in there. We don't have anything to believe that it was a suspicious death. We think it was a natural, but she died in her bathtub, and she had a tankless water heater, and it was on hot. So a tankless water heater will supply continuous hot water and until it's turned off. So this hot water had been running for days. We don't even know how long she'd been passed away, but there was really just skeletal remains left. So what happened was all of her tissue, her fat, her muscle, everything had essentially cooked away, and it had washed out of the bathroom and into the living room, the hallway, and she had a recessed living room about a couple of feet. So there was like a pool of water. So going into that house, there was mold all over the walls, the ceiling. It was probably one of the worst environments that I've ever had to go into, because it was about a foot deep of water. So me and one of the officers went in just to clear the house to make sure everything was safe. And then I went in. I had a full biohazard suit on, respirator, and I had to go in and look at that body. It's not the funnest thing to do, but it made for an interesting scene. But one of the things that we found on this body was we got dental records from her family, and we identified her with dental. But then she also had a emergency alert bracelet with her name on it. So all of those things helped with identifying the body, because there was really only skeletal remains left. But those are the warning signs. When you get those calls, just be prepared that you're going to have to go out, and it's not going to be pleasant, but you're going to have to go out and investigate. So you have to be prepared at all times. We've talked about this many times in the classes that I teach, in the book that I have out right now about death investigation. It talks about being prepared. What materials do you need? So at a minimum, you're going to need a mask, ideally an N95 mask. If you go into a scene like I just talked about, where there's mold, you're going to need some kind of a respirator probably. Fire department can help you out with that if you don't have it already. You're going to need shoe covers at a minimum, absolutely gloves. Don't go into any scene without gloves. Flashlights. Consider these cases. These bodies have been dead for a period of time. I've been into plenty where they've been dead long enough to where their power had been shut off. So there's not going to be any light at that scene. So you absolutely have to have a flashlight. I feel like I could investigate just about any case if I've got gloves, a mask, and a good flashlight. So flashlights are absolutely a must. You need to have bags that seal. Think about what you're going to be collecting at these scenes. You're going to be collecting things that help identify the person. You're going to be collecting like wallets, credit cards, money. You're going to be collecting cell phones to help with notification. And they're not going to smell good. So you have to be prepared for that. You don't want to be transporting all of that potentially, biohazard material in your car back to your office. You want to have it in bags that seal. So those are all really important. And then just mentally prepare too. You have to consider, what are you getting into? You're getting into a really bad environment, an environment where somebody died and has been dead for a period of time. You're going to have to start thinking about, possibly water hazards, mold. There's a lot of rodents in these cases. I've seen plenty of cases. I just went to one the other day where the person had been dead so long that the mice were even dead on the floor in the house. There were insects, and then also the multiple distractions. You have to think about family being there, and how are you going to explain this horrible situation to that family? Obviously, they're not going to be able to visually identify that person anymore. So you're going to have to explain to them the condition of the body, all the while thinking about, what they're going through. So you can't just throw it out there that this person is decomposed beyond visual recognition. You want to approach it in a more sensitive manner, and you're going to have to get critical information from them, because a lot of the things that you would normally get on a fresh body, you're not going to have anymore. So the family is going to be a huge resource. So just mentally prepare when you're going out to these scenes and responding. And then just something I always talk about is just consider every decomposed body as being suspicious. I know we always train that every single case you're going to go into it and treat it as a homicide. But there's cases that are obviously not homicides, some that obviously are. But decomposed bodies could go either way. I've had a number of decomposed body cases where I go in and I find injuries on the body that nobody even considered possibly being there. I've had the experience of seeing others go into cases that are decomposed and they don't find the injuries until that body comes back to the morgue and gets x-rayed, or maybe a week later gets an autopsy, and then you find out that this person has a gunshot wound to the back, or has some kind of like a ligature around their neck, or some other injury. These are all things that you want to try to find on scene, because it's really going to help the overall investigation. I had a really weird decomposed body case one time where, fortunately, I did find the injury. This was a guy that was decomposed inside of a house. So law enforcement went in, they found the body on the ground. It was kind of somewhat of a hoarder house. He was a younger guy. And there was even a decomposed animal there. So this person had been dead for long enough to where his dog had died and decomposed as well. But we found an injury on the body that was absolutely not consistent with normal animal activity. So normally when animals start to chew on the body, they're going to go for like the nose, the lips, the face. They might go for the fingers. They're not just going to go straight into the abdominal cavity and start just chewing away on the body. That's pretty unlikely. Most animal activity cases that I've seen, they'll start with the extremities or the face, the ears maybe, but they don't just start digging a hole into the abdomen. And that's what we saw. There was a big hole in this person's abdomen. There were other things that made it seem somewhat suspicious going into it, but I believed in this case that was probably a gunshot wound, because animals aren't normally going to go just straight for the abdomen. And turns out it was. So what had happened was this man was shot. He had an abdominal injury, but then his animal who was there at the scene started chewing around that wound. So you didn't see the normal characteristic features of a gunshot entrance wound that you would identify on a fresh body. So you always have to be considering, the possibility of this being a suspicious case. I've also found bodies that have gunshot wounds to the head, and I identify those on decomposed bodies. I've had a lot of really interesting cases that were related to decomposition. Also, a side note on that one with the gunshot wound to the abdomen, I love looking around the scenes. That's like one of my favorite things to do. And so if law enforcement, wants help searching the scene, I'm totally on board. And so we were searching the scene together, looking for cartridge casings, because we thought it was a gunshot wound. And then we start seeing hair on the ground, and it looked like it was buried. We start thinking that there's multiple bodies at the scene. Turns out this person had multiple doll heads, like realistic doll heads. And so probably at least 5 different times we pull out this doll head and, thinking it's another dead body. But so that was kind of the one that I don't forget. Every time I drive by that house, it was kind of a weird one. And then just another thing to consider when you're talking about decomposed bodies being suspicious. Even if it's not a homicide, or even if it's not a suicide, or even an accident, even if it's just a natural death, just by default, just the sheer nature of it being a decomposed body should set off some red flags in your mind. Think about your day-to-day interactions with people. Like for myself, I contact my mother who's in her 70s. I talk to her at least once or twice a day. I talk to other relatives several times throughout the day. People that I know that don't really have anybody around, even they get phone calls on a regular basis. So if that person has been dead long enough for their body to decompose and nobody has contacted them or checked up on them, or like apartment management has not checked on them, neighbors, I mean, if that grass is growing to the size of trees and nobody is checking on that person, that should be a big red flag. That should be concerning. So just the fact that that body is decomposed and some of these things are happening at the scene, you should, start to think, what are the possibilities? What could have happened? So that's just kind of the mindset that you need to have going into decomposed bodies. Just treat them as suspicious and you can't go wrong. Just make sure that as an investigator, you're putting your hands on that body, check it head to toe like you would do any other case. Check the neck, check the back, check the arms, the hands. If there's clothing there, check the clothing, undress them. I know it's not pleasant, but you have to do it. That's your job as an investigator, is to investigate, and that's what we're there for. That's why we get all this specialized training, is to be able to find these things when no one else can. So how about time of death? So time of death on normal bodies, usually you think about like body temperature, rigor mortis. Rigor mortis, remember, is stiffening of the body. It's going to set in after a couple of hours. Then lividity, the same thing. That's going to be when the blood settles after you have died. Those are going to be things that will help you to determine time of death in fresh bodies. So maybe they've been dead a couple of hours. Maybe they've been dead a day. But once that body starts to decompose, all of those things are going to go away. That body's going to be cold. The rigor mortis is going to start to go away. Lividity is going to fix, and then it's just going to turn into decomposition. The body's going to start discoloring. There might be some Tardieu spots or marbling of the veins, but for the most part, once you start to decompose, all of those good time of death signs are going to start to be gone. So just some of the things that as a death investigator you can think about to help you to identify time of death. You're never going to be able to know time of death for sure because it wasn't witnessed and you're not going to have those good time of death indicators, but it can help. So what about last seen alive? That's really vague, of course. I had one the other day where this guy had actually been dead for 6 months, and I was able to confirm that with a lot of things inside of his home. Family said that they had talked to him 6 months prior. The neighbor said that they were pretty sure that they saw him a month ago. There is absolutely no way that neighbor saw that guy up and moving around a month ago. That is absolutely impossible. So you kind of have to take some of this information with a grain of salt. It's not always going to be accurate, but it can give you an idea. So I knew on that case, I was looking at 6 months to a month. I knew no matter what, we're going into a decomposed body, but how can we start to narrow down that time of death? Because, maybe it's not critical for the death investigation, but the family really wants to know too. And they're not going to be able to go in there and see all of this information firsthand. So they're going to be relying on you as an investigator to give that to them. So you really want to try to make sure you're in there doing your best job, trying to identify some of these features at a scene that can help you determine time of death.
Are you wanting to further your education in death investigation, or maybe you're looking to enter the field? The Death Investigation Academy is where you need to start. With accredited training, both online and in classroom, you're sure to find the courses and education you are looking for. The Death Investigation Academy is nationally recognized and is a proven leader in education for the medical legal death investigation industry as well as law enforcement. Check out the Academy today by clicking over to deathinvestigation.training. Again, that's www.deathinvestigation.training.
What about insect activity? We're not going to go into it in detail, but the life cycle of the fly using entomology, that is a great way on decomposed bodies to start to determine how long someone's been dead. If you might have a homicide case where the body's outside and you've got insects on the body, and it's really going to be critical to know time of death, that's when you might want to consider the use of an entomologist. I'm going to do an episode just exclusively on entomology and insect activity in the future. What about newspapers? So newspapers, you always hear that newspapers are piled up outside the house, but what about inside? So you want to try to figure out when was the last day that this person brought a newspaper inside the house. So there might be a whole bunch outside, and then there might be a couple inside. So you want to try to narrow down what was the last day they brought one inside versus what is the date of them outside. I mean, newspapers are kind of going away. Now people are just looking at the news online, but think about the bodies that you're going to get that are decomposed. These are probably going to be the people that are still getting newspapers, so it can help. Same thing with mail. When was the last time that the person brought mail in versus what is the date of the mail that's outside? It can be a good indicator of, a ballpark idea what day this person died. Mail is also going to be really good. I've used it a lot of times to help make notification. These people are decomposed for a reason. They're not keeping in touch with people on a regular basis. So if you have like an elderly person inside of a house and they're decomposed, what are you going to use to notify family? A lot of these people aren't keeping in touch with family. So I always look on like mantles. I look in dresser drawers for Christmas cards or any like birthday cards. I've found many times where people will put their phone numbers in the card, or at least at a minimum, you're going to find an address and a name on the outside of the card. So that really helps with family notification as well as determining time of death. Phone calls. A lot of these people in the decomposed body cases, they have these old flip phones, or they even have a phone in their residence. I myself don't even have a phone at my house anymore. I just use all cell phones. But a lot of these people still have phones in their houses where you can look at incoming versus outgoing calls. If the phone is locked, maybe consult with law enforcement to see if they can get the information off the phone, just to help you with family contacts or ingoing and outgoing calls. Another good indicator of time of death is food that's out. Think about things that are going to mold and how long it takes them to mold, like bread. Sometimes, if you've got fruit and vegetables on a counter and they've got mold all over them, well, that person's been dead for a little while. So that can all help you with the time of death. Condition of the yard, inside and outside. Just look at the grass. Is it being cut on a regular basis? And if so, who's doing the cutting? Do they have a gardening service that comes? And if they do have a gardening service that comes and the yard is well maintained, well, there's probably going to be some kind of a letter on the door that says that you need to pay a bill. Those are all things that can really help with time of death. Inside the house, I always look for calendars. Calendars are a great way to determine how long someone has been deceased. For example, the case that I went to just recently, the person had been dead for 6 months. His calendar was still on December. And so there was December in the mail. There was December on his milk container inside the refrigerator. That was something that I thought was really interesting. I hadn't really considered looking at that too much in the past, but he had a milk container inside his refrigerator and the expiration was in December. So think about how long you're going to keep milk in your refrigerator. Probably not too much longer than the expiration date. So if you find expiration dates on foods and vegetables and even like milk containers inside a refrigerator, that really helps to narrow down time of death. And then, of course, medication bottles too. Many of these cases, they're probably not going to the doctor on a regular basis, but if you get lucky and they do have medications, well, look at the last time they were filled. Call the pharmacy up where they were getting their medications from and see when the last time they picked up medications was. Elderly people or people that kind of keep to themselves, if they're pharmacists, and the people at the pharmacies actually a lot of times have relationships with these people to where they could tell you, we saw this person 2 weeks ago, a month ago, 3 months ago. We were a little concerned about them, but we weren't sure what happened. So pharmacies are even a good resource. Now on to identification of decomposed bodies. It's not always easy. And so once you get past that point of visual identification, it can be really hard. Those are some of the most challenging cases. But again, I love the decomposed body cases. I love the skeletal remains cases because they're a challenge. There's something different than you get on a regular basis. So let me just talk about identification first. So there's scientific identification and there is non-scientific identification. Non-scientific identification are things like visual identification. So that could be a family that goes in and says, yes, that's my relative. I will, certify that is in fact, my aunt or my uncle. Photographs. So like ID photos, like we have the California IDs that have their driver's license. Those are a good source of photograph identification. And then, of course, circumstantial. Sometimes you're going to have a case where there is no other option but to say that it's a circumstantial ID. You've ruled out everything you possibly can. And, although you're not 100% sure, you're very confident that this is your deceased person. Just be really cautious using circumstantial ID. If you are working a homicide case or something that might go to court and that identification is questioned, you want to always utilize a scientific method of identification. So scientific methods of identification are going to be fingerprints. If you've ever had a decomposed body, you know that fingerprints are not always possible on decomposed bodies. Dental records. People that don't actually do this work think that dental records are going to solve everything. That is not true. Because what if the person doesn't have dental work? Or what if you can't track down dental records? So that's going to eliminate the possibility of dental being used for identification. And then what about DNA? So it's the same thing. Everybody thinks that DNA is going to solve everything, but that's not always true. You have to have not only a DNA sample from your deceased person, but then you also have to have a family reference sample to identify that person. And then, of course, you can use things like hair or items like a toothbrush that person used exclusively to identify them. But it's better to go with a family sample. That way you can say that, you have more confidence that is the person that you are trying to identify. So just on decomposed bodies, visual identifications, sometimes it can be done. Sometimes the person has such a unique appearance that family can identify them. Maybe the family member found them and says, that is 100% my relative. There's no way that somebody else is going to be here in this residence. Photographs, the same thing. It's almost not possible with photographs to identify a decomposed body. Circumstantial, you can use it sometimes. Fingerprints. I've been able to get some pretty good prints off of decomposed bodies. If they're in that kind of 2 to 3 day stage where they're bloated, the fingerprint ridges are still going to be available. But once they get to that like mummified stage, or they start drying out more, if there's been animal activity, if they're outside, you're probably not going to be able to get good fingerprints. If you don't know about it or haven't used it, there's a compound called microseal. It's MIKROSIL. It's kind of like a silicone compound. It's a putty. So you mix the microseal with a hardener. You put it on the finger. You kind of gel it on the finger, and then once it hardens, you can peel it off. And that fingerprint has then been transferred to the microseal. And then somebody who's an experienced fingerprint examiner can compare that microseal print to a known print of the person. It's very helpful in decomposed bodies. If you haven't done it before, try to team up with somebody that can teach you about it. It's very useful, especially in decomposed bodies. And then you can also photograph the fingerprints sometimes. And then, but those are all things that you'd want to utilize the resources of a fingerprint examiner. But you can get creative too. I've had cases where, and if you haven't had this, it's pretty unique. So sometimes decomposed bodies, the whole top layer of the hand or the finger will just kind of slide off. So the fingerprints are in the outer layers of the skin. And so if that layer slides off, well, then you've lost your fingerprints. So if you can utilize that outer layer of the skin and fingerprint that, you can get a good print. So I had a body one time that was in a hot tub. He had been in there about a week, and it was still boiling by the time I got there. It was over 100 degrees. So you can imagine what that body was like. The cop there, I could still remember his face as he was like gagging, leaving the backyard, and he just told me, just figure it out. So it was hilarious. But I don't remember seeing him go back to any more decomposed bodies after that. But when we were pulling him out of the hot tub, his hand just kind of slipped off, or the skin did. So what I was able to do is, and this is a valid technique, you can actually slide the skin of the finger over your own finger or your glove. Definitely wear a glove when you're doing this. And then you can roll your print. And you can get a good usable print with the skin that has slid off that hand. It's very useful. I've also done this in homicide cases because once that body goes to the morgue, if you're bagging up the body or bagging the hands, and then they're going to sit for a couple of days, you might lose that skin. It might get torn. So your best bet is to do that on scene when you first find that body, because they're only going to get worse after you take them to the morgue. So it's a very usable technique, and it's worked great the times that I've used it. If you ever have any questions about these things, you can always email me. You can always call me. My email is jeffreygentry.bpa@gmail.com. I'm always available for questions, and I love the questions too. If you ever have any comments about what I'm talking about, I love it. So dental records, again, we talked about that a little bit. The person has to have dental work, or the deceased person has to have dental work, and then you have to have dental records from when they were alive to compare it against. So it's not always easy to find. So think about that when you're considering dental record comparison. And then DNA. DNA is great. It just takes a while, and it's going to cost some money. So we use the California Department of Justice to do our DNA work. And if it's a homicide case, they will somewhat prioritize it. But if it's not, then it kind of sits there for a while, and you might have to wait a couple of months before you get a result. We also have a rapid DNA machine, but that is very costly. And so we have to kind of pick and choose when we use it. So good sources of DNA might be in some cases, you might get blood still out of a decomposed body. You might have to resort to like tissue, like liver or kidney, or even muscle in some cases to get a good source of DNA. But then you can also use things like bones and fingernails. If the body is decomposed or skeletonized, you're going to have to consider what sample is going to be best. So consult with your DNA analyst and see what they recommend as a good sample. And then, of course, you're going to have to get a family reference sample to compare it against. If you are ever working, like I said, a homicide case, maybe the identity might not be questioned at the time, but you better make sure that you're saving some kind of a sample, because if that case goes to court and people start questioning the identity and you don't have a good answer for them, that case could go real bad. So you want to make sure that you always prepare, especially when it comes to identifying that body. Remember, it's the responsibility of the coroner or the medical examiner to identify that body. So you have to make sure that you are prepared to back up how you have identified them. Just make sure that you're using scientific identification for these suspicious or homicide cases. All right, so moving on to cause and manner of death. We've talked a lot about decomposed bodies, about their condition, ways that you can identify them. But remember, the job of the coroner's office and the ME's office is cause and manner of death. So how are you going to identify cause and manner of death on a body that is decomposed? A lot of the things that the pathologist is going to be looking for is no longer there. So the brain starts to liquefy, the organs start to liquefy. That body might be covered in maggots. That might just be skeletal remains at this point. So what are you going to do to determine cause and manner of death? What information can you look for at your scene, and what information can you look for on that body to help identify that? At the scene. So that's where the investigators get to shine. They get to show off their skills. That's where you're going to help with manner of death. Where was this person found? Were they in a bathtub? Were they in the bathroom? Were they on the floor? Were they in bed? Were they in the backyard and under a tree and you find a ligature hanging from the tree? Were they in a grave? That's all going to help you with manner of death classification. But then cause of death. How do you identify cause of death? So if it's just a natural death, you're going to look for things in the house like medications. Medications are going to be a great resource as to what is this person's medical history. Maybe you can't track down medical records, but you sure can find medications to help you indicate what they were taking. Appointment cards, even though they probably haven't been to a doctor in a while, especially if they've been dead for 6 months. Appointment cards, you can contact the doctor and maybe they won't sign the death certificate, but they can at least help you to understand what this person had going on before they died. In some cases, it might just be undetermined. Undetermined is one of the classifications of manner of death, and it's most common that you would use an undetermined manner of death in a decomposed body case. And then again, you're going to want to identify wounds on the body. I had a couple really interesting decomposed body cases a while back. One in particular was police officer called me out, and I don't think the police officer had even gone inside the residence, but it was kind of a hoarder situation. This guy lived in an apartment. It was upstairs. Again, the same thing. Neighbors hadn't seen him in a while. And then they started smelling something. They called the police out. Police kind of took a peek inside, and they was like, that's a job for the coroner's office. So I went inside, and immediately I noticed, even within this whole mess of a residence, I noticed an envelope. And on the envelope, it was addressed to family. So that should be a big red flag, right? I mean, if you're listening to this, you should already be thinking that this case is probably a suicide. If somebody is intentionally leaving things out on tables, or maybe they have their keys, their wallet, an envelope, and it's addressed to people, that should be a big red flag. Right away, you should be thinking suicide. How did this person harm themselves? And I did exactly that. So this guy was very decomposed in a bathtub. He'd probably been there for a couple of weeks. There was water in the bathtub. There was fluid all over the floor. It was tight quarters. It was really hot. There was insects. There were flies everywhere. But once I got him out of the bathtub, I was able to identify that he had actually self-cutted. So he had multiple wounds to his forearms and wrists. And if I hadn't noticed some of those scene things like the letters, the wallet, the keys, I might have very well missed those injuries. It's not easy to identify those things on really decomposed bodies. So you have to pay attention to your scene. So not only did that help with cause of death, but it also helped with the manner of death classification as well. And then I had another one not too long ago where a woman, again, very decomposed, same thing. When I got there, the officers were actually outside watching a sports game on their phone. They didn't want to go inside. And, that's fine. I mean, they're just waiting for me to get there, but I don't think they had even gone inside because same exact thing. When I got there, there was a letter on the table and it was addressed to family. And it said that, I'd notify this person of my death. So again, that should be a big red flag. She was very decomposed, and what I was able to find was multiple insulin syringes on her counter. So that, again, helps you to identify, possible manner of death and also the cause of death as well. Just make sure that you're looking around your scenes, make sure you're examining your bodies, because that can really help with identifying both manner of death and the cause of death when one is not obvious. And then, of course, when you get into like skeletal remains, we didn't talk about that much, but I am going to much more in the future. When you have a case that's either buried or partially buried or found out in a remote area and their body is skeletonized, then you have to start thinking about how are we going to determine cause and manner of death. And so that's when you might want to consult with those entomologists. You're definitely going to want to consult with an anthropologist in addition to your pathologist examining those bones. The last thing that I want to tell you about is probably one of the worst days of my life, and it had to do with a decomposed body. So I went out to a decomposed body where this guy was found in a driveway. It was middle of summer. It was pretty early still in the day, but his body was out in the full sun. So he was getting to that stage where he was starting to bloat a little bit and his skin was starting to slip. And so what I did was, when I was removing all of his property, everything looked pretty good at first. I didn't see any injuries on the body, but then I got to the part where I was going to start removing his property. And when I started to remove a bracelet that he had on his arm, he had one of those really tight bracelets. And when I removed the bracelet, the skin slipped and some of the juice went right in my mouth. I wasn't wearing a mask, and that was 100% my bad. I should have been, and I don't know why my mouth was open at the time, but the juice went right in my mouth. And it didn't taste real bad, but you should have seen the look on the cop's face. I mean, he almost died right there. So I ran to my car, started wiping my tongue down with alcohol wipes, which I don't know was any better, but that was pretty disgusting. I mean, that is definitely something that sticks out. And I was a pretty young investigator at the time, and now I wear masks on everything, especially the decomposed bodies, because I do not want those flies in my mouth. I don't want the juice in my mouth. It is not cool. And that was definitely a learning experience. Don't do that if you are just starting out. Another one that I had that definitely is memorable. It was a guy that was in a trailer, and it was in the city, so it wasn't out in a remote area or anything. And this trailer started leaking, and it smelled really bad. Again, it was in the middle of summer. I think this was July, and like I'd mentioned, it gets up in the hundreds in July here in California. And so me and one of our transport drivers, we have a transport company that actually helps us remove bodies from the scene. So we go out as investigators, and then the transport helps us. We were removing this guy from this top bunk, and his body just kind of popped. And so juice just went everywhere. It was a horrible smell. I mean, there were flies. It was hot. It was just me and him in there. We were wearing masks this time, fortunately. But when that body popped, we just got covered in it. And so he didn't really like the decomposed bodies. I mean, nobody really likes them, but he started immediately vomiting in his mask, and I'll never forget the look on his face because his eyes got really wide and vomit just started squirting out of the sides of his mouth. But he was pretty hardcore. He was going to keep going. And so I just told him, just go outside, take your mask off. I'll finish this up myself. And so I was able to get him out of the trailer myself. But that was pretty horrible. And so I remind him of that every single time that I see him. It was great. So that's just a few of my memorable decomposed body cases. I have so many more. If you've taken my classes or you've listened to my other little podcast episodes, I've been doing this for about 15 years as a death investigator. I'm also a certified crime scene analyst. I'm a certified bloodstain pattern analyst. And I've worked well over 3,500 death investigation cases, and they're all unique. I still, even after having been doing this for a long time, I love going out on cases. That's what keeps me in this work. And decomposed bodies are some of my favorite. They are the most challenging, and those are the ones where I have found the most weird injuries on bodies where nobody else would have. And it really helps to show you how much experience you have. And, even if you don't have a lot of experience, if you take your time and you're doing a good job, you rely on your training, you will find those injuries, even on decomposed bodies. Just make sure you're rolling bodies over, make sure you're checking the neck, the chest, the back, and you'll do a great job out there. So I appreciate you listening. If you have any suggestions for me or any ideas on things that you would like to hear about, please let me know. I've got multiple training classes online with the Death Investigation Training Academy on bloodstain pattern analysis, suicide investigation, and death investigation. I'm going to be releasing that soon. I've got multiple books on Amazon. And thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Coroner Talk, a DSPN media production. Visit our website at coronertalk.com. And be sure to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/coronertraining.
3617, 1024 scene en route to morgue.